I didn't really even realize the contention that people have regarding the Exodus itself, that some even say it didn't happen. And I never even considered that as a possibility. I know the battles that I tend to fight where people want to contend on certain things, but I always thought that was a foregone conclusion. So regarding the Exodus, what evidence is there of this mass of Israelites, or soon to be Israelites, coming out of Egypt and going into what would eventually be Canaan? Because some will say, well, we can't distinguish between the Hebrews and the Canaanites because they lived the same way. But then when you really dig a little deeper, there were certain differences in the way they gathered, or in the way they maybe built their structures, or in the way they, you know, worshiped or did different things. So you can see distinctives where it's almost like if a group of people from another country moves into your neighborhood, you're going to notice certain distinctives, not better or worse, just you're going to notice certain differences, right? What evidence is there for the Exodus itself, that these Hebrews coming out of Egypt going into Canaan?
Wow. So yeah, that is a great question. And let me just say that we have got even better than some of the things that you have laid out. We've got better than that, which I'll come to in a moment. We've got some truly amazing evidence archaeologically for the Exodus, and it's getting out there, but more and more Christians are not really they're not really seeing the big picture, and that's what I've been trying to do in my talks. I do a lot of talks on the Exodus, and I've studied this for goodness, probably 20 years. And this is one of the subjects that's near and dear to my heart. So let me say a quick word very quickly, Alex, about the importance of the Exodus. We can't just throw away the Exodus, not just like one of these things. Oh, well, what do you think about the Exodus? Well, I think this and I think that. No, right. This is the salvation event in the Old Testament. This is the thing that everybody looks back to. In fact, when Jesus died on the cross, he died on Passover. He was the fulfillment of the Exodus. Right. So if the Exodus didn't happen, then Jesus is a fraud. And everything Jesus said, in fact, all of the early apostles, all the early New Testament writers, when they quote scripture, they're not quoting the New Testament. They're quoting the Old Testament. They're quoting Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. Jesus, when he's out in the wilderness, tempted by Satan, he quotes Deuteronomy all 3 times when the Israelites were in the wilderness. So
I think he quoted more from Deuteronomy than any other book, right?
Absolutely. So the Exodus is not a throwaway event from an apologetic standpoint. It is critically important. I would say it this way, Alex, that we apologists spend a lot of times, rightfully so, defending the New Testament, and that's right. And if you think about the analogy of a tree, you've got the tree is above ground, a big oak tree. You got the leaves out there, but on the bottom is the roots, and the leaves, and all the beautiful things we see above the surface in the New Testament, they would have no life apart from the roots in the Old Testament. And so, if you cut off the roots, then you have no life in the tree. So that's why I think as an apologist, it's important that we defend the Old Testament. And we defend the historical reliability of the Old Testament, because Jesus said in Luke, I believe it's 16, he says, if you will not believe Moses and the prophets, you would not believe though one rise from the dead. Right. So he places a lot of emphasis on Moses and the prophets. And if we won't believe Moses and the prophets, then we won't believe some of the things that we read about in the New Testament. So with that being said, goodness, where do I begin? It's like Dinesh D'Souza said when he was debating atheists, he says, I feel like a mosquito in a nudist colony. Where do I begin? No, I'm just kidding. So let me just say, gosh, there's so much about the Exodus. Let me hit the high points here. Let me hit the greatest hits. Number one, let's just try to summarize the best way I can, the quickest way I can. Number one, the big question is, when did it happen? A debate that Christians, even evangelicals, debate about is over the dating of the Exodus. So there is the early date and the late date. The early date is about 1446 BC, okay? And I'll give the reasoning behind that. The late date is about 1236 BC. So if you take the late date, then that places the Exodus sometime during the reign of Ramses II, which we know a lot about. He was the longest reigning pharaoh in Egyptian history. He reigned for about 77 years. And so we know a lot about the reign of Ramses II. Okay, but here's the thing, is that if you're going to take the Bible seriously, as James Hoffmeyer points out, the Exodus and conquest stand or fall together. So wherever you plant your flag, whatever date you plant the Exodus date in, you also have to figure in 40 years of wilderness wandering, and then you have to figure in some kind of conquest in Israel at about 40 years after that. So when you start looking at the archaeological evidence for and against the early and the late date, in my view, and I've said this for 20 years, and I can just spend hours talking about this, but in my view, the best evidence for the Exodus lies in the early date. And I'll give you one couple of internal evidences in the biblical text itself, and then we'll get into some of the archaeological evidence. Number one, 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1 says that Solomon laid the foundations of his temple 480 years after the Israelites came, after the Exodus. So most scholars, even liberal scholars, would say that Solomon laid the foundations of the temple in Jerusalem at about 966, 967 BC. So when you do the math, you come to a date of 1446. So internally in the text itself, if those dates are correct, 1 Kings 6:1 is narrative. There doesn't seem to be any poetic imagery there. So it seems like you should just take that literally, that 480 years. Right. It's not a round number. It's the accurate number. And then also in Leviticus talks about the Jubilee cycles that happened every 7 years. So when you count the Jubilee cycles as they were counted after the wilderness, then the Jubilee cycles also match what we see of an Exodus 1446 date. So then the question then becomes, well, who was reigning at 1446? And this is where you get into a question of Egyptian history. So there is a high chronology and a low chronology of Egyptian kings and pharaohs. And the view that I take is that when you adjust for chronology, and I think there's good scholarly reasons for doing this, this places the Exodus, 1446 Exodus date, in the middle of the 18th dynasty of Egypt during the reign of a pharaoh by the name of Amenhotep II. Now, his father was a pharaoh by the name of Tutmosis III. His stepmother was a queen pharaoh by the name of Hatshepsut. And Hatshepsut is one of the most well-known women from the ancient world. I would say, aside from Cleopatra, the Greek/Egyptian princess that ruled Egypt during the first century, Hatshepsut is probably one of the greatest Egyptian queens that ever lived. And Alex, this is interesting. This is not just my own view, but one of my scholars that I follow, Dr. Eugene Merrill, in his book, Kingdom of Priests, according to this chronology, if we are right about the chronology, it is very likely that Hatshepsut, when she was a teenage girl, pulled Moses from the Nile. Moses would have grown up in the Pharaoh's household and would have known Tutmosis III. So when Moses murders an Egyptian, he flees to Midian for 40 years, and he comes back, then Tutmosis III is dead, and his son, Amenhotep II, is reigning. And so when we look at that time period in Egyptian history, there is a site in Egypt called Tel El Daba, and it is in the Nile Delta. So you got the Nile that flows from the south to the north, and it empties out into the Mediterranean in the Nile Delta. Now, on the eastern branch of the Nile Delta, the site called Tel El Daba the ancient site is called Avaris. And this is where we actually see a very large Semite population. These, we believe, are Hebrews. And they show up during the time of Joseph and Jacob. Jacob would have, again, according to the chronology that I'm following, Joseph and Jacob would have entered Egypt at about 1876 BC. So they're there in Egypt for 430 years, exactly as the Bible says. So later in the reign of, I believe it's Amenemhat III, I'm not exactly sure which pharaoh, but basically it was the pharaoh when Joseph was alive. There were 11 tombs found at Avaris, with one large tomb shaped like a pyramid that had a statue of a guy with a coat of many colors. And this statue was basically destroyed. Somebody chiseled the face off. Now, who would have wanted to chisel the face off? Well, it would have been angry Egyptians, because these Semite Hebrews left Egypt under Moses. But there's so much more. And I'm going to end with this. And this is a slightly controversial. When I say controversial, I use that in quotation marks. The reason why I say it's controversial is that scholars have not accepted it yet because it's so new. So one of my colleagues at ABR, Doug Petrovich, who's an Egyptologist, and he's really more of a paleographer. Well, he studied these inscriptions found in the Sinai Peninsula. So basically, you've got Egypt, and separating Egypt from Israel is that large little triangular piece of land called the Sinai Peninsula. Well, down on the Sinai Peninsula, there were these turquoise mines. And there were people that were Egyptian slaves, I guess you would. They were actually mining turquoise for the Egyptians. Well, there are these stelae, we talked about stelae before, that actually contain this very ancient writing called the Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions. And nobody really knows what this language was. So it's a combination of Hebrew and Egyptian. And we know, according to Doug, again, I'm not a paleographer. I've read his stuff. I've interviewed him. According to Doug, most scholars know that this language on these inscriptions are actually Semitic, which means they could be Jewish, they could be Akkadian, they could be any number of languages, but no one's really broken the code of these Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions. So what he proposed in his book called The World's First Alphabet is that Joseph, get this, when he was in charge, he put his brother Manasseh and his, because his brothers came into Egypt, put them in charge of the turquoise mines, and every year they would go down, they would make these inscriptions. And Joseph very likely created this language that was part hieroglyphics and part Hebrew, and it was the Proto-Hebrew language. Now, here's the cool thing about this. This is amazing. So he has, based on this decipherment and based on this work he's done, he has deciphered some of these inscriptions, and guess what, Alex? He has found the name of Manasseh. He has also found the name of Moses in these inscriptions. In fact, this is really cool. Guess which year the last inscription shows up? 1446 BC. Isn't that crazy? And this is what the inscription says. It says, I'm going to paraphrase it, and I can send you a picture for the listeners who want to see this. If they want to see this inscription, it says, "Our bound servitude had lingered. Moses then came and provoked astonishment." So, in other words, they're basically saying we were enslaved for a long time, and then Moses came and he did all these great stuff, and now we're out. Now, here's the cool thing: that language disappears out of the Sinai Peninsula in 1446, and then it shows up in Israel. And this is where scholars get confused, and it looks like Ugaritic. So, most scholars believe that Paleo-Hebrew comes from Ugaritic. But what happened is that after the 40-year wilderness wandering, the conquest happens in 1406 BC. And so that language then migrates up into Israel. And not only that, but the site of Avaris, guess what, Alex? It goes blank archaeologically in 1446 BC. Isn't that cool? I'm just telling you that. There's so much. I could just talk about this for days, but that's just a scratching the tip of the iceberg, to use a mixed metaphor.
Go ahead.
In Petrovich's further work, he's done some work on Amenhotep II, and it seems like in the 9th year of his reign, now his father, Tutmosis III, was considered to be the Napoleon of Egypt. He does 17 military campaigns into the Levant. This is the area in Israel and Lebanon and Syria. So when he dies, his son, Amenhotep II, who's the Exodus Pharaoh, he does several, maybe half a dozen, 5 or 6 campaigns. And then in the 9th year of his reign, his military essentially goes missing. And he does no more military campaigns. Now, this is at the height of Egyptian power. The only two superpowers at the time were the Hittites, a group called the Mitanni, and the Egyptians. And this is the height of when Egypt was at its height in military power. So there's no reason why, unless the military was defeated in the bottom of the Red Sea, why this whole thing would disappear. But it makes sense. It actually fits what we read in the biblical record.
Wow.